Let's go to Ndumiso Hadebe now. He's an economist at KH Research Equity Partners. He joins us. Ndumiso, good afternoon to you. There's a lot to go through in a speech like this. It's unprecedented times. Overall, the finance minister seems to start almost with a ringing call for structural reform. In other words, a real change to get our economy to create jobs. He's hinted this way in previous interviews. It's a ringing call. He's appealing for it. Is it in his speech?
I think that's always been the biggest challenge for South Africa in terms of the implementation of these structural reforms that are associated with the medium-term budget policy statement, of course, the budget in Feb. And I think what will be quite critical here is that we've seen the establishment of the infrastructure fund in the presidency. We've seen some of the work that ASISA is doing. And what has also been highlighted is that, albeit this medium-term budget policy statement has been tabled and the allocations of over 100 billion rands, as the minister had mentioned, towards infrastructure, the rebasing of the South African economy actually requires about 700 billion rands per annum in order to meet the infrastructure deficits that we presently have in South Africa. Now, this is closely aligned to what referred to as the gross fixed capital number, which needs to be at least 30% of GDP. Now, that's 700 billion rand. In this medium-term budget policy statement, 100 billion rand has been allocated. That's just to give you context. To fill that gap, it requires a number of public-private partnerships. It also requires the implementation of these structural reforms so as to generate better or greater tax receipts in order to finance these infrastructure backlogs.
I mean, there's a lot to it. So, I mean, there's a lot of targets. I mean, clearly, the beginning of next year is going to be busy. I mean, everything's supposed to be done by March.
Yeah.
Part of it is, for example, I mean, digital terrestrial television. The communications minister said that will happen. I don't know if it will. E-visas for 15 countries to make it easier for tourists to come here. But we've been discussing this since, I think, Malusi Gigaba was the minister who stopped it.
You're quite correct. You're quite correct. I think the proof will be in the pudding in this instance. From an overall and strategic intent of the MTBPS, I think the minister did touch on the salient issues that are important for this particular forum. But again, it really becomes a proof in the pudding. And I think also the credibility associated with the minister as well might lend itself to some level of confidence, which of course was dealt a blow as a consequence of the July riots and so on. And we're seeing that a lot of investors that want to continue to invest in South Africa are saying security issues around our investments, implementation of projects that we have on the ground. How can we be sure that even in the district development model, our investments are secure in order to ensure that they're able to realize the social impact and also the return associated with that? So it will really be in the pudding. He's cited that he has a course of action that premiers ought to put in place when it comes to reforms or adjustments that need to happen at a local government level. That's quite important because where investment happens is at a local government level. So whether the municipal manager or the mayors on the ground have the capacity to ensure the proper oversight of some of these bylaws and projects that are happening in those areas, it becomes quite critical because it either would encourage the investment that is required or it will create a stagnation when it comes to attracting investment in very important SEZs and other areas.
I mean, one of the things that we've seen is a huge focus on rail infrastructure simply because there isn't that much left, unfortunately, after what happened during the hard lockdown. In a way, quite an economic reform to allow private operators to have their own railway engines, their own railway trucks. I presume their locomotives will be the right height. And as a result of that, they will then be able to... So quite a few things happen here. They will use ostensibly infrastructure that's owned by a state-owned entity. So they're using something that's owned by a government. That also means that government is getting money for that, right? So it provides income rather than just cost.
Correct. It certainly does. I think it would aid the revenue diversification from a government point of view. But I think it also highlights the very important role that rail infrastructure has to play. For instance, when it comes to the agricultural sector, manufacturing, which is more inland in South Africa, oftentimes the cost of traveling or transporting goods to ports is often quite expensive as well. So I think the question of investment in rail is quite important in that regard, and it's important that he highlighted it, but also the inclusion of third-party players to play in that role in order to greater increase the capacity and volumes that are associated with goods and services also becomes quite important. And I think it would certainly be reflected in the tax receipts that are collected by the collector of revenues.
Ndumiso Hadebe, we're not going to let you go anywhere, I'm afraid. There's so much more to look at in the medium-term budget policy statement 2021.